Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Russellville, land of golden opportunity. This is a part of the semi-quincentennial celebration of our nation's 250th and Colorado's 150th anniversary. And I'll tell you, I probably spent about half the time I did preparing for this by just practicing that word, and I nailed that word and then messed the rest of it up. This presentation and story is brought to you by the Douglas County History Repository, and I am so proud to be your host this evening. Again, my name is Laura Miller. I am Norma's daughter. I am a school counselor by trade, which means I'm not actually an expert at doing this. Most of the time when I'm talking in front of crowds, I'm probably yelling at them rather than telling the story, but I will tell you the story that we have for you tonight is a really fantastic story, and I am so excited to be the one to tell it to you. So Russellville, land of golden opportunity. Tonight we want to share the story of the town of Russellville, located in central Douglas County, just south of Parker. Our story begins with the town's namesake, a man by the name of William Greenberry Green Russell, a seasoned prospector and a miner who came to Colorado in search of gold and who very possibly played a small but pivotal role in drawing attention to the region, helping to set the stage for Colorado's eventual statehood in 1876. Green was born in 1818 in South Carolina into a well-established mining family. In 1828, a 10-year-old Green, along with his father and his two brothers, Joseph Oliver and Levi Jasper, headed off to Georgia on rumors that there was a large amount of gold that had been discovered there. Over the next 10 years of his life, Green and his family, along with several other prospectors, would find around $20 million worth of gold in the Georgia gold rush at a site that was known as Auraria. And auraria is a Latin word that just simply means gold. Green learned everything there was to know about prospecting over those 10 years, including learning that the search for gold was the life that he wanted to pursue. He married Susan Jane Willis, she went by Suki, in 1845. Suki was of Cherokee descent and would eventually help Green connect with members of the Cherokee Nation, who would, over the years, greatly contribute to his overall success in the pursuit for gold. Between 1849 and 1853, Green and his brothers tried their luck twice in the California gold rush. You might remember the old rush of 49. The first trip for them was across land, giving Green a good sense of the natural features across our country, including the mountains and the natural river systems in the area that would become Colorado. And true to Green's nature, he was able to find a good amount of gold on that first trip. Spurred on by the success of that first trip, Green returned to California a few years later and continued to find gold. Enough gold, in fact, that he was able to purchase travel back home via steamship down through Panama. Now, Panama Canal would not have been created until 1904, so it wasn't there then. So they walked across the land. But that would be a 47-mile trek to the east side, which is a much better walk compared to the 2,500-mile walk that he did across our country. So I feel like they probably felt that was a pretty bougie little travel that they did. They picked up a steamship from there and headed up the East Coast back home on that second round. Overall, Green was able to find enough gold to fund his future prospecting adventures, as well as to be able to buy a 500-acre homestead in Georgia for Suki and his growing family. Hearing about possible gold strikes in Colorado from others, plus having his own knowledge of the land in the area, Green decided to head back west in 1858 to look for gold in Colorado. And these are from the repository. These are two photographs of Joseph Oliver and Levi Jasper, and then a drawing of our good friend Green. And I love this drawing, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Green was an accomplished prospector and was well known for his loyalty, empathy, and leadership. It wasn't hard for his brothers, a few close friends, and the members of the Cherokee Nation to follow him into the wilderness to look for gold. They trusted that he knew exactly what he was doing, and that trust would eventually pay off for all the members in the party. And so I love this drawing of Greene, and this is pretty consistent with what I found in the research. In that time, in the 1850s, the fashion of the day was to wear long, thick, heavy beards like his brothers did. And you can tell they're brothers. You can see they have the exact same nose, all three of them, right? But Greene was, Greene kind of marched to the beat of his own drum. And instead of wearing his beard down, he actually chose instead to braid it down into two sides. And so then the black tie that he was always known to wear would be showing. And then he would also go ahead and wax off the tips of his mustache so that they would curl up correctly as well. And I love this about Greene because what it says to me is this is a man who knew his own mind. He knew himself, he knew his confidence, and he knew exactly what he wanted to do, and he knew exactly how to do it. And I think that's why it made him such a natural leader, and it made it so easy for the members of his party to follow him into the wilderness. And again, like I said, it pays off for everybody because they all find gold and they all do quite well. Greene and his party set off to Colorado in the spring of 1858. News of possible gold near the Rocky Mountains was spreading pretty quickly, and it wasn't long before others joined his caravan traveling west. By the time they reached the confluence of Cherry Creek and South Platte on June 23rd of that year, the party had grown to over 100 men. Within that first month, Greene's core party, plus an additional crew, spent their time looking for what's called placer gold, which is really gold that's in the runoff of the river tributaries. And they looked for this placer gold in the different river systems that were in the area. So think about Cherry Creek, South Platte, Ralston Creek, Dry Creek, in those areas. Unfortunately, in that first month, they didn't have much luck, and many people from the larger party started to give up and moved on to something else. Our friend Greene is not one to give up, and he kept moving along, and in late July, he gets a strike in Little Dry Creek. He finds 20 troy ounces of gold. Now, a troy ounce is a specialized unit of measure that is used to weigh precious metals like gold or silver. And in those days, in 1858, the 20 troy ounces would have been worth $380. In today's money, that is about $15,400. So a pretty good find after a month or so of not having a lot of luck. This spurs him on, and he continues on, looking at the different tributaries and working through the area. By October, Greene decided to make the small camp that they had been living at an established settlement that he named Auraria, after the place that he first found gold back in Georgia. Now, you might all be familiar with Auraria. I know I am, because today that is Auraria campus. And that houses the University of Colorado at Denver, the Metropolitan State University of Denver, and the Community College of Denver. And I actually went to the University of Colorado at Denver for my master's degree. I spent years on that campus, and I never, until I did this presentation, know about where the origin of Auraria was. But having done this and knowing that this comes from Greene Russell is such a neat connection for me personally. And it actually gets better, and what Greene does here gets better as we move along. But that's the story behind the Auraria campus. Now, if you're curious, Denver was established and becoming bigger at that point as well. Denver was going to be just on the east bank of Cherry Creek, so not far from Auraria. And of course, we know Denver would overcome Auraria and become the city itself. Greene strikes again later in the fall of 1858, several miles south of Auraria, following down Cherry Creek. News of that find also spread fast, and a settlement was quickly established that would eventually be called Russellville. As for those of you who live out there, do we have anybody that live out in the Russellville area? Yes. So as you know, this area is a beautiful combination of prairie valleys and thick pine forests. And Greene and his team weren't the only ones there. A small settlement with an established sawmill was already there at a place called the California Ranch, which was run by a man who may be familiar to you, James Frank Gardner. His sawmill provided the wood materials needed for the settlements that were being built in the area. California Ranch would eventually become the town we know as Franktown. There wasn't really any direct evidence that I could find that James Frank Gardner and Green Russell met, but most of the research agree that they must have because they were in the same area within miles of each other around the same time, and they both needed the same kind of resources and materials. So we figured that they probably met, and my guess would be, I don't know, I think maybe they would have gotten along, but maybe they didn't because they both kind of wanted to establish settlements and be kind of the big guy on campus. So I'm not sure. I kind of guess maybe they didn't get along so well. Who knows? We don't have any evidence, so I don't know. So the gold at Russellville was all placer gold, and soon the gold pans stopped turning up the flakes. Green knew the flakes that they were finding was from river runoff, and I think he knew that there was a much greater chance of finding larger deposits of gold if he headed west to the mountains. And he decided to do just that. By the summer of 1859, which is just a year later after he arrived, the miners in his group packed up and left the settlement at Russellville to head west for the mountains. But Russellville wouldn't be unoccupied for long. In the late 1850s and into the 1860s, settlements along the Rocky Mountains became very popular stops along the established wagon trails as travelers were in need of supplies. And so this is a map of what it would look like for travelers back in the mid-1800s. For the most part, travel from the east to St. Louis was going to be pretty well established. It wasn't hard to get there. But from there, you really did have to strike out kind of on your own. And it wasn't long before these wagon trails sort of got established, and people were able to follow those. But even then, there was still uncertainty around finding water and food resources. So you did have to kind of have your wits about you as you went along. And so some of these names might be familiar to you. We have the Cherokee Trail that runs a little bit south and goes down into what is now the Oklahoma Territory, and then the Santa Fe Trail, which kind of goes a little bit south in Kansas, the Smoky Hill Trail, and then of course the Oregon Trail that goes a little bit along the northern edge. Most people who wanted to arrive in Colorado would go kind of on these southern routes, and that was because there were more places to stop for food and supplies. The Smoky Hill Trail was the most direct route, but there wasn't a whole lot along the way. And so you were taking your chances if you went on that. So most people chose to go the extra miles and go along those southern routes. Our friends in the Green Party went along the Santa Fe Trail when they arrived at Auraria. Just a few months after Green and his friends traveled west towards the mountains, Russellville flares right back up to life as a vital stop along the Cherokee Trail. And so this is actually a photograph of the barn at Russellville. This was taken during the archaeological project that was in the 1990s. But I wanted to show you this because this is actually where that stagecoach stopped. And so this was going to be the sort of the center point in town and really where all the supplies and people were going to be. Now, think of this beautiful photo in this beautiful barn. Take out our two archaeological friends and the electrical floodlight. And that gives us the 1880s version, or the 1850s version of this barn. But luckily for us, this is still standing and quite well out there today. In addition to those seeking gold and settlers that were seeking a new life in the West, there was also new political interest in the area as the major issues of the time, which was the expansion west and the right to own slaves, brought new attention to the land and the resources in the area that would become Colorado. The expansion west and the right to own slaves were the big topics on everybody's mind during the 1850s. Westward expansion and a planned transcontinental railroad made territorial organization a vital priority. They knew that the territories needed to have some government organization in order to make sure that that railroad was going to be built and run across. Previously in 1820, the Missouri Compromise was passed in an effort to keep the balance between the free states and the slave states, and it essentially created a line that prevented slavery from expanding out of the southern states. However, with this new need to expand west, in 1854, Stephen Douglas writes the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which is an effort to address the need for this organized expansion west. Unfortunately, this act included a clause that was known as popular sovereignty, which essentially meant that the settlers in those territories could choose for themselves whether they wanted to own slaves or not. And this effectively dissolves the Missouri Compromise. This ignites a larger concern for those who are anti-slavery, including our good old friend Abraham Lincoln. And this inspires him to run against Douglas for a seat in the Senate in 1858. Now, we all know about the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates. That was in 1858. We know that Lincoln actually loses those debates, and he ultimately loses the seat in the Senate. But those debates bring him enough notoriety that he has a very successful run for the presidency in 1860, and thank goodness he did, right? So we have Abraham Lincoln on the scene, and we have the issue of slavery is becoming a very, very hot topic for this country, and hot enough that it eventually leads to the start of the Civil War in 1861. Both Union and Confederate forces traveled to the Colorado Territory seeking gold and resources to fund the ongoing war. Union forces generally controlled the area around Denver, while Confederate troops pushed northward from the south, making settlements such as Russellville frequent sites for conflict between the two sides. It quickly became pretty important for locals in the area to arm themselves, as well as set up defenses. Local cavalry units started setting up in Russellville, as well as in nearby Franktown. Small gangs of Confederate sympathizers started taking up to stealing gold and supplies rather than prospecting it for themselves. And one such gang might be familiar to you. One of the famous ones is the Reynolds Gang. The Reynolds Gang was a band of Confederate cavalrymen, about 20 or so men that were led by the brothers James and John Reynolds. This group of men were actually sent up by the Confederate Army from Texas to do exactly what they were doing, which was to steal as much gold and supplies as they could. They managed to steal thousands of dollars worth of gold and cash before they were finally caught by the Union Army in 1864. Some of the money that they had taken was recovered. However, some say that there still may be some $40,000 to $70,000 worth of gold and cash hidden somewhere up around the hills in Deer Creek. I don't know. We can take our metal detectors and go up in Deer Creek. So the Reynolds Gang was running around in Douglas County, but they were also running around up in the mountains as well. So they were getting they had a lot of notoriety before they were finally taken down. But I don't know if anybody goes up to Deer Creek to look, but some say. I don't know. Now, things began to settle down after the Civil War ended in 1865. The town of Russellville continued to be a supply stop along the wagon trails, and folks began to settle down and set up ranches in the area. By 1870, the Kansas Pacific Railroad was finished and completely changed the way that people traveled across the country from the east. Stagecoaches were still running as Colorado formally became a state in 1876, but were completely gone by 1880. And at that point, Russellville is left to its own once again and silently became the ghost town that we know today. A little over 100 years later, a new kind of prospector showed up in Russellville, the Civil War artifact enthusiast. With the use of metal detectors, history enthusiasts started hunting for metal objects that could potentially be connected to the Civil War. One such group of enthusiasts, a metal detecting club out of Aurora, decided to try their luck out at Russellville in 1993. After concerns were raised by property owners in the area, the director of the Douglas County Historic Preservation Board, a man by the name of Clyde Jones, wrote a letter to the Douglas County government asking for help to stop these private citizens from finding and keeping valuable artifacts. Eventually, the partnership with the county and the Historic Preservation Board, they were able to negotiate with this metal detecting club, and they were able to recover most of the artifacts from the club. And the county granted permission for a full, formal archaeological study of Russellville. And that brings us to 1994, where the archaeological site at Russellville is opened up. The objective for this site really was to provide enough historical evidence to qualify the site to have a Douglas County landmark designation, which the program actually did. And really what that means is it gives the county a lot more power to keep private citizens from trespassing and taking valuable historical objects for their own collections. So it was a good move. And I have a few photos of just kind of what the site itself looks like, and I like to start with this one because it does show, you can see in the background, some of the buildings that are still left from Russellville. There's the barn where the stagecoach stopped, and then kind of along behind it, the longer building is a milk barn, right? And then over next to that is an ice house. So the structures are still out there, and those of you that live out there, you know that these are all still out there. And then in the forefront is our archaeologist friends, and they're doing exactly what we'll talk about here, which is the nature of how to run an archaeological project. And in this case, the use of metal detectors was a major factor in this site. That's not always the case for archaeological sites, but it was in this case. And then you can see here the traditional archaeological activities are also very present at this site. So here's just another look. Archaeology is not always on an easy, flat place with no weeds. Most of the time it's on a curvy place with lots of dips and lots of weeds and bugs and you know what else. So this is a good site of our archaeologist friends disappearing into the weeds. And in this one, this is milkweed, right? That's in the forefront here. Snowberry. Okay, so I don't know much about it, but I think it was kind of sticky and icky, right? Yeah. So we find the metal artifacts where we find them. And so if we have to be in the middle of the sticky snowberry, we have to be in there. So there we are. This is just another great photograph of the archaeologists. And then this is looking out over the open space area for Douglas County. And I added this one just to give you a sense of just how big the Russellville project really was. And now even archaeologists need to have a little bit of rest in the shade. So I wanted to include this picture as well, just to show you that we had a few of that going on too. We do have some examples of some of the neat artifacts that we did find at this site. So this is an example of a horseshoe that they found. This is a percussion hammer from a firearm. And again, remember, these are all metal objects, so we find these using the metal detectors. This is a 6-link harness chain, and this is something that would likely be used to connect either oxen or horses to wagons. This is a lid to a Calumet baking powder can, which I just think is the neatest thing. And I think we have this here. This is one of the objects that we have here. You can't see it on the slide or on the photos very well, but you can kind of make out the word powder. Biscuits were an easy food source for people that were traveling on the wagon trails. You just needed some flour and a little bit of baking powder. You could throw that in your pan over the fire and make some biscuits. And so it's not surprising that they would find something like this at a site in the Civil War era. This is a key. We don't, unfortunately, have any provenance on the key. We don't know what this unlocked. Maybe it's the treasure up in Deer Creek. I don't know, but it is pretty neat. And you can see it's actually a pretty intricate key, which I think is kind of neat. So a few of the smaller items, and a lot of these are here tonight, you can see. This little button is a general service tunic button. And then right next to it is a hook and eye that would have been used for larger coats or capes. This little guy in the corner is a piece of jewelry. We don't have much information outside of that, but I think it looks really pretty. Somebody must have cherished it, I think. And then next to that are various 58 caliber mini ball bullets. And this is actually really important because mini ball bullets were developed and created by the French and were brought to America just as the Civil War was starting. So finding mini ball bullets at this site here in Colorado gave us confirmation that what we were looking at was Civil War era artifacts because mini balls would not have been in the ground from any other time. And this is just a neat photograph of one of those mini balls in situ. In situ is our archaeologist's fancy word for in the ground, how we found it. And this is a petrified wood point base, and this gives us the provenance that we know that we weren't the only ones in this area, and that this area was also had a great presence of a large, vast variety of different tribes, including the Cherokee, the Arapaho, the Lakota, Ute, Apache, and Kiowa tribes. So how are archaeological projects done? What is the methodology to ensure that we're doing right by the history when we're doing an archaeological project? It starts with a surface survey, which simply means the archaeologists on the project will line up and do a walking survey of the ground in a grid pattern to ensure that they're covering all of the area that they want to cover as a part of the site. And in that survey, they look for surface artifacts. This is typically where we're going to find more of the prehistoric artifacts like the chipstone, the projectile points, things like that. Once the surface survey is complete, then we set site parameters and set up grids at 200-foot squares. The wood stakes with the GPS coordinates were used to place at each of the grid corner points so that we had GPS for each grid location. And then we used metal detectors to identify the subsurface metal objects within each grid. A pin flag was used to mark each identified metal object. Archaeologists then used traditional archaeological excavation methods to locate and remove each artifact. Strategic soil removal, including screen boxes, was used to ensure that all artifacts were located, and then a depth of the artifact was measured and a field specimen number was assigned. Once that was complete and we collected that artifact, we wanted to make sure to leave the land just as we found it, so we replaced the soil, and a pin flag was placed back in for mapping. And the reason that's important is at the end of each day on this site, we would go back through and map all of the pins so that we could use that for metadata analysis of the site. And we'll talk a little bit about why that becomes important here a little later. Now, just a few examples of some of the strategies that we use, some of the methodology they use. This is a photo of our archaeologists setting up grid lines. This is a field of pin flags, and I think you can see this a little bit. Remember, these are photos from 1994. But you can see, so those pin flags become pretty important, at least for this type of site. And then here's an example of these little box screens that we used. So every piece of soil that we pulled out of the ground on this, we sifted through just to make sure that we captured everything in that area. And this is me. So I'll tell you a funny story about this. I went to CSU for my undergraduate degree, and I majored in anthropology with an emphasis on archaeology because I wanted to be like my mom, right, at that time. And this is right after I graduated from CSU, and I was pretty excited to get out and be a volunteer archaeologist at this site. I didn't know the story of green at this time, and I didn't really understand fully about the meaning of Russellville. I'm glad I do now, and I feel like this is kind of a full circle experience for me because of that. But here I am, little archaeologist on the site. I didn't find horseshoes and Calumet baking powder cans or mini bullets. I found fence staples and horseshoe nails. And that's because most of what we found at that site were fence staples and horseshoe nails. And after a while, you get a little bit like, I kind of want to be like Indiana Jones and find something cool. And that's just not how archaeology goes. It's more fence staples and horseshoe nails, right? But here's the thing about that, kind of going back to the metadata analysis. Because of where those fence staples were positioned, using the metadata, we were actually able to determine the fence line that was there during that Civil War time when Russellville was a settlement. So the smallest objects can actually still contribute pretty big in a way when we're looking at archaeological material and formulating a report about that. And so this, I'll just have you take a look at this. Somebody shot this beautiful photo to the west from the Russellville site. I don't know if you have any memory of this particular photo, Mom. But we found it in the slides, and I wanted to add it here just because, A, I think it's beautiful, but B, I think it also reminds us about whatever happened to Green. We sent him west to the mountains a little while ago. Let's find out what happens with him. So Green's intuition about more gold being available in the mountains was totally correct, just like it always was for him. He was able to find additional placer gold deposits in a valley in Gilpin County, which we now call Russell Gulch. Being a Confederate sympathizer and a good Southern boy, he becomes a little bit nervous as the Civil War progresses and decides to return to Georgia in the early 1860s. Unfortunately, his worry was realized as on the return home, his party, the entire party, was struck by smallpox and then captured by the Union Army. They were held in New Mexico for several months by the Union Army and finally were released upon being forced to swear allegiance to the Union Army. I got a sense that I think Green probably cared a little bit about that, but I don't think it let it bother him. I think he just wanted to get home. And so I think he probably was like, okay, yeah, this is fine, whatever. Got on his way, right? So he gets home, everything's fine, and he decides to return to Colorado a few more times after the war ended, and then finally gave up on gold prospecting altogether after, sadly, his son John was killed in a mining accident in 1874. Green and his family, Suki and his children, finally settled at a ranch in the Oklahoma Territory where he died in 1877. So I love this graphic because it really does show, I think, the impact. So remember, the story here is about a man who I believe, and I'm making the argument, contributed greatly to Colorado becoming a state. And here's a good representation of why I believe that. We now have an established place at Auraria where he first stops at the confluence of Cherry Creek and South Platte. We have an established settlement at Russellville. And then we also have Russell Gulch up in the mountains. All of these named either for or by Green Russell and his family. And in each case, he brought more and more people along because they were hearing about the gold that he was finding in this area. And I believe that truly brings enough value to this area that gave us the kickover to become a state in 1876. Though its residents called it home for only about 20 years, Russellville played a meaningful role in Colorado's early development and stands as an example of the toughness, perseverance, and spirit that characterized not just the American West, but Colorado specifically. I would like to finish our discussion this evening with a note about Clyde Jones. Clyde was incredibly passionate about preserving and documenting the history of Douglas County. He was pivotal in bringing the importance of preservation to the attention of the Douglas County government, a legacy that still exists today as the Douglas County History Repository and its volunteers remain as an important funded entity of the Douglas County government. Thank you, Clyde, for your dedication, perseverance, and your great support and friendship. Thank you all so much. We have some time now to open this up for discussion. We would love to hear your questions, and I may not be able to answer them, but I have my experts with me. If you are interested in learning a little bit more about Russellville or just the history of Douglas County, the Douglas County Repository has a virtual museum. The link is available here on the slide deck. This slide deck will be available on the 150-250 Douglas County website. So if you want to come back and take a look at that. I've also included a bibliography of the research that we did to make this presentation possible. So if you're interested in digging a little bit more into Green, and I think you should, I think he's a neat guy, pretty excited. I would have a beer with Green. So at this point, we'd love to hear your comments, questions, and we'll pass the mic.
I'm wondering about Gardner. Was he a Confederate sympathizer or a Union sympathizer, or were most of the people down in that region Confederate sympathizers?
So I was trying to find a little bit more about that, because really all I could find was that was kind of a skirmish line, because really the Union people were more in Denver. I didn't find anything about Gardner, but my guess is just my guess. No research to back this up. My guess is that he was Union.
Across from the Russellville Ranch, the first house on the west side of Tamichi was purchased by a guy named Jim Gantner, who I worked with in the late 70s in downtown. And there was an article, I think, in the Douglas County News at some point in the late 90s that they had found a bunch of U.S. Army artifacts on his lot, and they opened it up for some archaeological excavations, and I think some was done by high school kids, so I'm wondering if you know anything about that.
We were invited by Mr. Gantner to do an archaeological survey on his property, And again, using the metal detectors was the best way to do that. We patterned the way we did that with metal detectors with the way they did it at the Custer battlefield. We used that as kind of a model because at that time, back in the early 90s, metal detecting was kind of not as good a thing to do in an archaeological site, but it had been proven by the time we were there that it was very valuable. So that's why we use the metal detectors. And we do have quite a number of artifacts that came from the Sturgander.
So there was evidence that the cavalry or soldiers had, was there evidence that cavalry or soldiers had camped at that site?
Apparently there's some evidence that both the cavalry at some point and one of the Colorado volunteer groups, they had the 100 Days volunteers, and a lot of the Franktown men went with these local militias. And so sometimes we would find a few things that would say infantry, and then we'd find things that obviously used horses. So the cavalry, so they were both out there.
Just real, you mentioned the rental, did they get hung? Right there? Or
Nobody
was that just
knows.
a story?
Nobody knows what happens. Or
Right.
at least nobody has ever said what happened to the Russellville gang. The rumors are that they're buried out there somewhere.
Two questions. One, in your research, we have learned on the California Range, the Gardner facility, that there were Native American attacks on that facility. Have you found anything to verify that in your research? And two, how did you originally choose the areas in Russellville that you chose for the excavations over other places there?
Well, for one thing, we knew that the Metal Detector Club had been working in that area. And we knew what they were finding. And we knew that there's still probably many, many artifacts left. And the county commissioners and historic preservation people said, let's get in there and get it as much of the story as we can out of where we can. We were very, very fortunate to have that 80 acres of open space where we found so many of the artifacts. So we've got boxes of artifacts. We did that, and then of course the same thing with Mr. Gantner's property. We knew that the metal detector people had found some very interesting and part of the story artifacts from that site, so he wanted us to search that site as well. And by 1996, we had several of the residents out there in Russellville that said, come search our property and see if you can find anything. So we did do that. We did a few of the private properties where people wanted to know if they had any artifacts.
Come on. And I think to your question about what evidence we had as far as our interactions with the Native Americans that were in that area, we have some written documents, including the letters that were written to, it was Colonel Shivington? Major Shivington, I don't know, to Shivington. And then we also have like Rocky Mountain news articles that talk about the same thing. So we have some direct evidence documents, and then also a good amount of stone points and things that we found in that area as well that give us the evidence that we interacted with the Native Americans at that time as well. I chose to leave that part out of this presentation because I think I wanted to tell this story. And you know that of course is a part of the story of Douglas County as well. But this is the better story about our birth as a state, you know, in this wonderful nation that we're in.
I just want to thank you for being here, and I was very lucky to have her willing to tell you the story. And she treats it and I treat it as a story. And here tonight is one of my favorite professors and a very good friend of mine. And he always would say, it's not what we're finding, it's what we're finding out. And that is why we do the archaeology that we do.
Thank you all so much.
Well,